Welcome to part 2 of the What is a Diagnosis podcast.
Oh, I 100% agree. And I think I quite like this concept. I think that's been brought up a few times now around sort of a diagnosis compared to maybe a working diagnosis. I've sort of, and I think I'd even bullet pointed it down as something to bring up and then it was covered. So it was a sign that great minds think alike, hopefully, not to big myself up. But to sort of looking at, I guess, all the positives and trying to take away maybe some more of the negatives, I guess, giving that person, if they wanted sort of the working one, for their end, the sort of the validation that they, or maybe a way to help understand themselves more. I know it can be potentially helpful if, at least with me, I know that I was able to then sort of, when I was having some thoughts around, well, how come I, when they say sort of depressed side, how come I say all my friends, but a bunch of people who I know who have this, how can they all present identically and I seem completely different? And then it sort of is like, oh, am I doing depression wrong or whatever? And then finding out it might be a bit different. It's like, oh, no, actually, that's okay. I'm allowed to have things differently. But equally, like you said, sometimes if they don't need it, and I think as well being aware with this podcast being sort of looking around young people's mental health, especially because it can go down to being a bit scary, I guess, when you're maybe in your early teens and you get given a label that can be seen as quite a troubling thing of sort of like, this is a big worry now that you have to have on your minds and there's something that's not normal with you compared to other people. And maybe, like you've said, if we're avoiding putting that on someone's shoulders and just leaving it for sort of the professionals to have sort of only helping as to when it's necessary and giving them the tools rather than giving them the problem, I guess, is where I was coming at for that approach.
Yeah, and I think there's something as well, isn't there, around kind of when adolescents are developing as well, you know, and trying to find a sense of who they are as a person, who they're going to be as an adult. It's a really important time within their life. And so what you're offering them, if they come in support from CAMHS at the same time, what you don't want is for them to kind of hold their development around this narrative of what you're offering them. It's like, you know, mental health is not an absolute, you've not got it or you haven't got it. It's a continuum, and I think we all manage that continuum every day. And I think I really like that that term that you came up before, Oli, something around what's strong, not wrong, and kind of looking at the strengths-based model and looking at how can we actually, you know, you've got all of these things that you're brilliant with, and let's use those skills that you've got to try and overcome some of these difficulties that you've got as well, but not embedding that label or that diagnosis within that development. And it's such a key stage within life. It's important that we build on strengths rather than just kind of saying, well, this is the diagnosis that you've got to live with for the rest of your life, and is that going to then, you know, dictate who you're going to be as an adult because you've molded yourself around that, where actually you need to be molding yourself around, you know, the kind of positive things in your life, really.
I think there's something about that in terms of the flipping it a little bit as well. Like, I remember when I got my diagnosis as a teen and they were like, oh, it's like depression and anxiety, but it's fine, like you can recover from depression or anxiety. And then I don't think it came to, you know, my head that sort of until about 2 or 3 years along the line that, okay, yes, right now I'm in a lapse of depression and I'm really, really suffering with my anxiety. However, I don't think it's quite going to be that easy of just, you know, recovering. It will be recovering and ensuring I maintain that recovery. It's not going to be a one-off situation where, you know, I recover and then I never have to think about it again. I will have to take sort of that, the way my brain works and the way my sort of mind functions, I'll have to come up with little tips and tricks to make sure I keep that under wraps throughout the rest of my life. And I think sometimes that's not quite explained, that, you know, this is who you are. It doesn't, you know, sometimes the way you are and the way you function, if you don't have good enough coping mechanisms, can result in mental illness. But it's still okay to kind of just be the way you are. I don't know if I've worded that very well, but I think on the flip side as well, saying, oh, you can have a bout of depression and then you'll be absolutely fine after, doesn't acknowledge a lot of the after effects and also the long-term effects for some individuals. So I think thinking about it from both sort of aspects is really crucial.
And I guess also looking at that flip to it, being aware that you don't want to sort of maybe not that it is a burden, but worry about burdening someone who's quite young and maybe worried about the whole experience they've been having with this term, that if you do a quick Google search, as most people probably, I can safely say I think most, if not all young people would probably do in that circumstance, would probably come up with some things that are just going to scare you more. I know I don't know if anyone else has seen it. I feel I always plug the show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, but it seemed to do quite a nice way of sort of debunking someone coming to terms with a diagnosis. And there's actually a very good song about it. But sort of one of the first things they're told to do is, right, so don't go away and just mindlessly Google and look on chat boards with it. And they immediately go away and do that and then get really worried, and then everything's overwhelming. And it's like, you're always going to be like this. And maybe for some people they might be struggling with low mood understandably, but it's not necessarily indicative of mental illness. I guess sort of normalizing that it's okay to access services because there's something else going on in your life, whether it's a big change in terms of moving house with it. Maybe you've had a rather negative experience. Maybe you're going through a bereavement. I think trying to show that it's healthy, I guess, for anyone to access mental health services at some point, and that these skills of coping mechanisms and sort of bolstering yourself up through a hard time doesn't make you weak, and it doesn't make you ill or something that you can only see if you're ill. It's sort of, it can be really helpful for everyone. And I know I've had conversations with professionals who said about how it would be great in an ideal world if everyone could sort of have a therapist or a counsellor or someone even to speak to like every now and then, just because it's helpful for everyone to have someone to sort of like have a chance to explain how you're feeling and someone to help you navigate that a bit more, even if it's not just to do with the fact that you might be suffering with a specific ailment at that time. I think in terms of our big questions of what's, why, who, I think the last one I had left to tick off on my little sheet was how. So I think with this, it was sort of, I think we've covered a lot of it already, but it's more just in case there were any little things that people wanted to debunk maybe. I don't know how well aware people are with sort of the DSM or the ICD, but to give a very, very vague overview, it's sort of maybe the manuals, the sort of the books in inverted commas that people might go back to for a bit of guidance that might offer a bit of sort of criteria of what you might be looking for. I guess a way to help people recognise that when we are looking at the diagnosis can be helpful, that, well, this is how term A is different to term B, and this is why someone with term B might want to seek a different method of support. But I'll open it to the floor if there's any things that anyone wanted to add around sort of diagnostic manuals, if they're useful, if they're not, if they are actually used particularly much at the moment.
So you've got two manuals, the DSM, which is the American version, and then ICD, which is sort of international guidance. The ICD covers, lots of health problems beyond mental health, whilst the DSM is more focused. As a guide on sort of symptom clusters and diagnosis, it can be helpful. Particularly it's helpful guiding I talked about, specialist assessment services, particularly with neurodevelopmental problems. We particularly will use those sort of criteria as part of their assessments towards a diagnosis. I have to say, personally, I wouldn't say that I used the manuals much in practice, because I think the clinical expertise in being able to make assessment and judgment is more valuable. I also think that there is my personal viewpoint is that there's an over pathologizing of behaviors of human nature, particularly in the DSM. Every time they create a new version, it's got more and more diagnoses, and I look at those diagnoses and I don't agree that they are mental health diagnoses. I think they are descriptive. I think the spectrum of what's normally acceptable within life, and particularly with young people, is higher than such criteria sometimes suggests. And we certainly see that in practice. We see parents that have sort of Googled certain problem behaviors and then gone and asked for a particular diagnosis from DSM, and for us I don't think that is what mental health services is about. We work with these mental health problems in which you've got distress, you've got dysfunction, and that should be the focus of our assessment and treatment. And the problem with those manuals is they don't always translate to the actual sort of human experience, to the explanatory models for why people do what they do. And and it's a limitation on diagnosis. Actually, sometimes it's not relevant, because the problem isn't because they've got such and such or they've got that pathology. Actually, the reason that someone may do what they do, is actually explained by social factors, by psychological factors. So certainly there are elements in which the criteria are helpful in service design, in certain assessment processes. But I think in actual clinical practice, personally, I think there is also limitations. And I find the DSM, particularly some of the new inclusions on diagnosis, I find very frustrating, and have been quite vocal online against it.
I think it's interesting to hear that, actually, and to see how it can actually be more cause of grievance than anything else in terms of updating. And I think you mentioned, there's been so many good points mentioned on this podcast. I feel like just sort of surrounded by a plethora of ideas. It's great. But sort of, I guess, around over pathologizing. Oh, I can't speak. But I'm like looking, I guess, in America as well, that ties in, I guess, to somewhat in the pharmaceuticals business, and there seeming to be something going on a bit beneath the surface as around to finding a way to sort of sell people medication in different formats. But I don't want to keep speaking, taking the airtime. I want to use most of you watch are both here. So, Anne, I don't suppose you had anything to add. Are these manuals things that you've ever really used, or are you of a similar viewpoint that it's sort of taking them as and when?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously aware of them, and as I said before, they do offer a common language, but for people. But again, it's how helpful are they? I think there's also the issue around that most of these statistical manuals, or they're quite culturally bound, so they change with society as society changes. So, for example, I think it was in 1973. I think it was the ICD-10. We had homophobia down as a mental illness. Clearly, nowadays we would never think that would be a mental illness. So it's changed within culture. So what we see within culture and how culture develops, it changes along that. So it goes back to the subjectivity of what mental health is and who decides what a diagnosis is and who doesn't. And I would agree in some cases that it's not always helpful in terms of using them, but I think sometimes they can be used as a bit of a weapon, really, especially from some areas. And so, you might have somebody that comes in. Sometimes we have some quite forceful parents that say, my child meets this, and this, so you must give them a diagnosis. And it's almost as though it's a given if they meet A, B, and C from their particular perspective, where actually there's probably a lot of other stuff that's going on that we need to kind of unpick and look at and kind of think about how we can, support that young child. So yeah, I agree with Cameron. I think there are benefits in some ways. They can be a helpful kind of structure in some ways, but I'm not sure they're always helpful within practice. And I don't think they always describe the nuances of what people struggle with in terms of their mental health. It's very, it's very kind of kind of dichotomous in some ways, in the sense that it has to be this and it's only this and there's not any bit. Well, people just aren't like that. You know, people are different all the time. They come with lots of different things, and just because of you know, if they didn't particularly or there was something a bit different about them, does that mean then they don't have the diagnosis? Autism is a perfect example of that, where there can be so much difference between one person with autism and another person with autism, but yet the diagnosis would be quite specific in what it is. But then there's all those different nuances, and it goes back to your point around schizophrenia as well, and what somebody might, you know, present with. So I think, yeah, they can be helpful, but not always helpful in practice, I don't think. Yeah, but they are a common language that people all kind of know and refer to, I suppose.
I think I like how you phrase that there, as sort of as a common language, as sort of giving yourself maybe the tools to speak about things, but maybe not always sort of not, I guess, like a language, as opposed to sort of it being like the mental health Bible in inverted quotes. And I know, yeah, there have been definite inclusions of a couple I've been aware of, and even some going quite disturbingly recent. I think there was still one around sort of gender presentation going quite up to sort of like into the 21st century around there. And I think potentially one into sort of what I'd interpreted at the time, but almost being like drag being put into elements of that, which I thought of as somewhat amusing, considering the popularity of the art form across sort of the shows and whatever coming out. And also, just to clarify with that, was it homosexuality with that you said that was the forbidden in the, that was...
Yeah, sorry, yeah, homosexuality, yeah.
It's not a double... I mean, it's, yeah, I think it, like you said, it just shows us to how, not fickle, but I guess how dependent it is on sort of the overriding cultural viewpoints of a time. And it'd be interesting to see actually if there's anything that would be drastically changed in 10, 20 years' time, or something that's currently in, or even if it was maybe about earlier, or if we were to look at a different culture, if maybe there'd be something else included that someone else would see as being completely unjust or like not related to it. I know just in other cultures, when we're speaking right at the back, we said sort of looking at the more spiritual approach. I guess it's looking to see, it depends on if people even view mental health as being something we can address in this sort of way. I think we've managed to have a rather great conversation. I know Bry sort of gave me little nudges towards trying to make sure to not just throw question after question at you. So I wonder what would be a good rounding off question. Bry, I know you've not had the floor too much. Have you got anything that you thought, because I think I've had a chance to ask a few questions that have been things I've been thinking about. Is there anything you wanted to ask while we have two wonderful professionals with us?
Yeah, I think the sort of question about sort of multiple diagnoses is quite an interesting one, and how as professionals you go about that. Do you think that possibly focusing on one sort of diagnosis, as I say, before the other, or how does that come about? As maybe if we want to pass over to Cameron first.
Well, I suppose it depends a bit on the individual. We do work with young people who might have sort of several different sort of comorbid difficulties. I suppose I really don't work with diagnosis. I think if you see my clinical letters, I never use diagnosis. I always sort of describe what the difficulties are and then use that to form the treatment plan. I think there probably are situations where certain assessments probably for me would take priority. So an example would be sometimes we get a young person that might present to us with high anxiety. We do our assessment and might think that anxiety is driven by them potentially being on the autistic spectrum. And then for us, actually having that assessment for the autism is really important, because it helps to give that explanation to understand what might be underlying the anxiety. That's not to say that you couldn't work with the anxiety and do something with it, but I think there are certain sort of avenues of assessment and understanding which would take priority because they help to understand the other difficulties, other elements. And the sort of idea of multiple diagnosis, I certainly know that I've got colleagues that might do that and have sort of a list of different diagnoses. Personally, I kind of encompass it into sort of one in a lot of situations in saying, look, here are the sort of presenting issues right now. Here's the context. Here are some of the underlying difficulties that we're already aware of, and thinking about how they all interlink. Because ultimately, what you want is you want to be able to guide sort of intervention. So having that list of diagnoses isn't actually always helpful. It's understanding how they interlink, what impact they're having in the here and now, and that then is what guides the different avenues of intervention that can help and make a difference.
Yeah, and I suppose that kind of really, in a way, emphasises the downfalls of the medical model, because if it were to be sort of several specific categories, sometimes they can almost conflict or would make it that little bit more complicated in approaching the situation. Whereas if you just take it as a person, sort of holistic approach, and kind of, as you say, treat an individual irrespective of the differential diagnoses, then I guess that can sometimes work out better. And just wanted to pass over to Anne, maybe to see if you had anything to add about sort of multiple diagnoses and the sort of complex cases such as that.
I think it comes back to how helpful is it, because if you're going to, comes back to labeling, doesn't it? And if you're going to give lots of different labels or diagnoses to somebody, then what does that say for them, and what does it mean for them? Because sometimes it can be that overwhelming, think, oh my goodness, we've got all these, how am I ever going to, live my life, or how am I going to manage, or am I just now going to be all of these diagnoses for the rest of my life? Where actually, as Cameron said, the point is around getting interventions that work and support them to work their way through it. So I think there are times where, perhaps more so in physical health, where multiple diagnoses, if somebody's physically unwell, then it can be perhaps better for them in the sense, well, they know they have to get this treatment, this treatment, this treatment. Whereas I think within mental health, we've got that ability to kind of draw them more together and not be kind of labeling and giving people multiple diagnoses. But again, it comes back to how is it going to be helpful? So if there's something where it's going to help a child meet their educational achievements within school, or if it's going to open a door to a service for them that's going to be particularly helpful to meet their life outcomes or improve their life outcomes, then absolutely it's helpful. But if it's not, then why would we, present that? And it's interesting when, and I use the word complex sometimes, but I do always find, well, people term things as complex, where actually for me, complex is just about not really understanding what's going on. And if you can understand what's going on, it's actually just a number of different difficulties that we're trying to organise and find an intervention for, as opposed to like naming something as complex as though, well, this is going to take forever to sort out, and how are we going to support this person? And it almost offers that defeatist kind of air about it, really, I suppose, before we've even started. So I think it's how do we make something that's helpful to the young person and the family, but also find a route out of it. What is the intervention? What is the treatment plan? Yeah.
I think how you managed to phrase that in the, I guess, not being too defeatist, I guess, in a way. And going down that avenue, I guess, of diagnosis after diagnosis, it can almost become like problematizing something, so sort of listing off all the different things that would possibly be an issue, and then being like, oh, cool, I have to tick them off. We have to, and people aren't really to be sorted out like that, really, are they? I know it made me think, because I know of a friend, just, I think, linking into this, it made me think of a friend who I know had been told, because they had a few different sort of diagnoses which they were given, and they were basically told in order to seek, because I think it was to do with the sort of rapid eye movement therapy, the new coming up one, in order to access that, she had to just get over her eating disorder. And that was just sort of what she was told in order to access. So she was then faced with sort of like, well, I really need this treatment. It could be very beneficial, but how do I get over? It's still shocking, I guess, to hear how it was phrased in that sort of way. And I think they ended up getting over it, I guess, shall we say, in inverted quotations, rather quickly in order to get access to that treatment, which was then incredibly beneficial. But it seems rather bizarre that, I guess, obstacles like that are put in front of people, and it's almost, I don't know, it's almost giving them prerequisites. It becomes sort of like an application to a process of being like, oh, well, you've applied for this job, but you've not quite got the qualifications, come back in 6 months. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess there's some of the difficulties, aren't they, when we've got NICE guidance, for example, that says, well, you know, for post-traumatic stress disorder, so trauma, you know, your first line would be CBT, but after that it would be EMDR. And so professionals or services are somewhat akin to those, and we have to almost follow those to say that we are providing the evidence-based treatment. But if EMDR is not, which is the eye movement thing that you were talking about, if that's not evidence-based for eating disorders, for example, within the NICE guidance, then they might struggle to say, oh, well, you can have this therapy while you've got an eating disorder as well, although there is increasing evidence base around you actually using it with eating disorders. But I think, yeah, there's some of the challenges that we're fixed with around diagnosis when we've got national guidance that's supporting that. And how do we actually, you know, how can we be more flexible around not just having to box people off and say, well, you're going down that pathway or you're going down that pathway, and looking at what the need is as opposed to what the diagnosis potentially tells us or doesn't tell us.
Yeah. From my side, it's hard. You can't really comment on the, you know, that sort of individual situation. I would say that we, in our own practice, we wouldn't necessarily have such clear rules that says you've got to deal with this, you know, before you can access that. Everything we do is as a sort of a discussion as a team, and even sort of discussion with other services. Even today, you know, I was in discussion with you know, such a team trying to coordinate care. But things can be complex. So you know, eating disorder is a big hot topic nationally. It has the highest mortality of anything that we work with. You know, it's hugely challenging, very, very risky, and particularly the recovery process from being very unwell and being very underweight can be a very difficult one. And so for us as a group of professionals, if we're thinking about what intervention is needed, there's quite a lot of different dynamics that we think about around not wanting to overwhelm someone with too much at once, too many different people at once. What's the best time of providing an intervention? So, you know, EMDR is terrific and can make a huge difference, but a lot of trauma work, things can be worse before they get better, because it brings a lot of this traumatic experiences and memories to the fore. So, you know, we certainly have had conversations where we know somebody will benefit from EMDR, but we felt it would be better that there was certain work was done in place to build up someone's resources, or that they were in, you know, a physical state of, you know, which wasn't compromised, where things were sort of safer and healthier to then do that piece of work. So I don't, for us, it's certainly not arbitrary that, you know, that we say, you know, when we might make such suggestions about not doing certain things at certain times, but it's always a sort of discussion and consideration. And ideally, you've got the young person, you know, at kind of the heart of that, and that being explained to them. And maybe that's part of what was missing for your friend, was actually them not really being helped to understand why they weren't going to be doing this sort of EMDR at that time. And another thing that I would stress is, for us working within CAMHS, we are so under-resourced, like ridiculously under-resourced, that that there's so much more that we want to be able to do, but we do end up having to sort of ration a bit around who accesses what and what's available. So and for me working within CAMHS, I find that hugely frustrating. I've been saying for years, I want us to be able to offer more, but we can only offer what we've got, what we're commissioned to, what's within the capacity of the team. And sometimes that's something that has to be sort of taken into account by a team in thinking about who accesses what therapy when.
I think that's a nice point you make there, that final sort of almost the lack of communication, because I think that's something we stress a lot throughout our participation work, is that as young people, or even sort of adult patients or whatever, that the most important thing is that communication. We're very aware of like lack of resources, or if they were to sit down and explain, hey, in order to go through this trauma therapy, there's certain steps we have to make sure that you've got in order to cope with the trauma therapy, because it can be quite distressing. And I think that communication a lot of the time can sometimes be missing, possibly because they think, especially in the case of young people, that they don't need to know. Or why do they need to know that we haven't got all these resources and things? They don't care, they won't understand. And it's like, no, a 15-year-old does understand money doesn't grow on trees, and that you can't just offer them everything in the world. We get that, and I think that's one of the main sort of things about this sort of collaborative approach that you've spoken about before, and sort of making sure young people and adults are involved in their care, because that's the key factor, and making sure that no one walks away feeling like they've not been heard, or like they don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. So I think that's a really, really great point to bring up.
And I think you've asked a good question there, Bry. I think that's helped tie us nicely towards sort of summarise, I guess, some of the key points to take away from this in terms of being really aware of the service user, being aware of some of the current boundaries, and also, I guess, sort of the perspectives of a lot of people, on the front lines, I guess, as it were. So because I'm aware that I could talk people's ears off for hours, and you've already been very generous in how much time you've given us, I just thought maybe to ask one by one if there's any final thoughts, any things you wanted to plug, anything you just wanted to sort of say to people while you can before we close off.
About diagnosis, or about anything?
I guess that's sort of up to you. Whatever you think would be the most useful thing that you could say using the platform that we've got here.
Well, I think probably what I've just said. So, personally, I'm hugely enthusiastic about the job. I love working within CAMHS. I love working with my colleagues. And I love working with the young people that I meet and hearing their stories and being a part of it. And it's a privilege to be involved and to try and help. I kind of sometimes conscious that the sort of the rhetoric around CAMHS can be a very negative one, and I, on one hand, I can understand it. I can understand that sometimes people's experiences aren't that positive. I can understand frustrations at being able to access help. Last week, the trending on Twitter around CAMHS. I was reading and looking at, and I found it really hard to see people being so negative about it, because from our perspectives, when we're in it, we're working with such limited resources, and we want to be able to do more. And I think the thing that I would encourage to sort of remember is that the people working within CAMHS, they are good people. Everyone that I met in all my years working within CAMHS, within the different services, they're all really good people, desperately trying to do as much as they can to help young people, but they are working in such a limited and such a difficult system. And we want to be able to do more. We want the experience for young people to be a better one, because that's why we do it. We work in this because, the more that we can help a young person to get a better experience, through childhood with their mental health, then the knock-on positives for them in the future can be huge. And we have those conversations all the time as a collective. So yeah, I think the message for me is, when people are being negative about CAMHS, bear in mind that CAMHS are good people desperately wanting to do a good job, and we're always crying out, wanting, needing more funding, demonstrating why we need more funding, and wanting to do more and wanting to do it better, if that's okay for me to say.
More than okay to say. I think just having both of you on here should hopefully really highlight to people just the amount of passion that really does go into people who want to work in services like CAMHS, and that it's not something that you go in for any other reason really, other than wanting to help people as much as you can. And I don't suppose you had any final takeaway points that you would like to raise?
I think I'd just emphasise Cameron's point really, and just to give a bit of perspective. So out of the entire mental health budget, CAMHS gets around 8% of that entire money. So in terms of what is spent on that, it's really limited. So I think, we definitely need more funding and more support, but there are very passionate and brilliant clinicians out there that work within CAMHS. And I would say that over the pandemic as well, and I know, Cameron, you've helped develop a website as well, haven't you, for CAMHS? And I think, there is help out there, self-help on people's websites. So whichever trust that you don't even have to look at your own trust website, but certainly all CAMHS services generally have got some self-help guidance. So if people are struggling out there and do want a bit of self-help for how they're feeling, then please go and look at those sites and get start that path of getting the information as early as you can, because you don't have to be in a CAMHS service to access self-help, and it is readily available, and nobody should struggle on their own, really. Yeah.
A very poignant point to leave it on. No one should have to struggle on their own. I don't suppose there's anything you want to say, Bry, or if not, I can just wrap us up.
No, just again, a huge thank you to our two amazing guests who have definitely proved that point about, there being passionate people working within sort of CAMHS and, mental health services. Because just to tell our listeners, they're giving up their time for free. So thank you.
So yes, thank you. We can't thank you enough, I think, for how informative this discussion has been. And now to go through the usual rigmarole of signing off. So for anyone, if you have liked or enjoyed today's podcast and want to know any more, please feel free to contact the Young Advisors across our social media channels. We have Twitter at all caps CYPIAPT, lowercase mid, and then YA uppercase, lowercase s, like mouthful, that one. And then Instagram at Midlands_YA, all lowercase, or you can see more about what we do at the website of www.associatesdevelopmentsolutions.com/the-Midlands-Young-Advisors. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue just yet. But I'd like to give a final big thanks to everyone for all the viewpoints brought on today and everything that's been discussed. And if I'd just like to let people sign off, so saying goodbye from Bry.
Bye.
Goodbye from Cameron.
Bye.
Goodbye from Anne.
Bye.
And goodbye from me, Ollie. Thank you for listening in, and join us next time.